mentioned, this is probably about 10 years in the making where I've tried to get an opportunity to talk to you about your experience, your life experience, which is being chronicled in a book which is coming out soon, Quiet Counsel, looking back on a life of service to the law by Larry D. Thompson. And I think that's coming out in November?
Correct, Greg.
So once we get done today, everybody can pre-order this on Amazon or wherever else. And if you happen to be lucky enough to be at Chautauqua during the summer, track down Larry and he'll autograph the book for you. I'm just thrilled. This is outstanding, and obviously this is September 11th, 23 years after a world-changing event. We'll talk about that soon, Larry. But the most important question I have is, in looking at your biography, is the fact that you got your master's in Michigan State and you got your law degree at Michigan. So go tell me, is it the Wolverines or the Spartans? What are you?
Well, whoever wins. So this week I'm a Spartan because we beat Maryland and the Wolverines got their butts beat by Texas.
Well, this is great. You know, you had such a long resume, and to actually go through this, we're going to go through your biography during the course of the interview. But you are a lawyer, you're a professor of law, but did that come natural? Does your mom and dad, were they of that profession? Is this something that came natural, or is this unique?
Mother and father, they were very good people. I think I picked the right parents, but they were not educated people. My dad worked on the railroad. He was a laborer. And my mother was a cook and sometimes a maid. And they were very simple people on one hand, but they also were people that really taught me to not be afraid to dream. They never said that there wasn't anything that I couldn't achieve. And so I think when I look back, I've practiced law 50 years this year. As I look back, I owe a great debt of gratitude to them because I did dream. They taught me and allowed me to dream. But how I decided to go to law school is interesting because I wanted to be a social worker as a child of the 60s. I wanted to help solve a lot of society's problems. And I had applied to do an internship position in St. Louis in a social work agency. I'd asked my history professor at my undergraduate school to write me a letter. And so at the end of one of our classes, he called me up to the podium and said, I got your request to write a letter of reference, and I'm going to do that. And there's nothing wrong with being a social worker, but have you considered the law? And I had not. I hadn't been around any lawyers in my life, but I did then immediately sort of transition my coursework to a pre-law coursework, and as much as I could at that point in time. I was going into my junior year, but that's how I first, got interested in becoming a lawyer.
So you went for your biography. You went to Culver Stockton College, graduated in 1967. You got your master's in Michigan State University. What was your master's in? Was it in social work?
It was in sociology.
Sociology.
Industrial sociology.
Yeah. Did you figure out what you might want to do with that as sociology?
Well, the reason I went to Michigan State, before I went to Michigan State, I had sort of decided I wanted to go to law school. But if you recall, those of you who may be my age, you could not go to graduate school and get a deferment from the war. This was during the height of the Vietnam War. And the only way you could get a deferment was to get a graduate teaching assistantship. Of course, those teaching assistantships were not available in law school. So I decided to pursue a master's degree so I could continue my educational exemption.
All right, here's the most important really question. Do you remember your draft number?
I'm before that, Greg. I was before the age of the numbers.
Oh yeah, I wasn't, so I remember that day specifically.
I had no number, unfortunately.
So then you went to University of Michigan Law School. Then you went to Ford Motor. Was that just a natural thing, being in Michigan, that you would work for Ford?
Yeah, I had a terrific professor in the School of Labor and Industrial Relations. I took a lot of classes there when I was at Michigan State, and he encouraged me to try the corporate world. And he had been a former executive at Ford Motor Company, and he got me into the management training program at Ford and encouraged me to try it. And I did try it. I worked in the field of labor relations for a couple of years and ultimately decided that was really not my cup of tea and applied to go to law school.
And then after you graduated, you ended up in St. Louis. Now I should point out you were born and raised in Hannibal, Missouri. Were you kind of trying to go back towards your kind of hometown?
Yeah, that's correct. I wanted to go back to Missouri, not necessarily my hometown, but I wanted to go back to Missouri. And then there was a general counsel at Monsanto who was undertaking a rather experimental approach to hiring lawyers. Typically, lawyers working for corporations, as we call them, in-house lawyers, they come from established practices, come from law firms. He had an idea that he would take 2 or 3 lawyers directly out of law school, have them work at Monsanto for a few years, and then put them in a law firm for a number of years, and then bring them back to Monsanto. And he thought that might be a better career path for in-house lawyers. And I think I've lost you guys. Okay, I got you. Well,
I think we got. Can you hear us now, Larry?
I can hear you.
Okay,
Yeah.
You're good.
Okay. So, interestingly, I want to recount this story because it's an interesting one. I decided to accept the position at Monsanto, and he brought in that year 4 of us who were hired directly from law school. And I came from the University of Michigan, and there was another fellow from, I believe, St. Louis University Law School. There was another fellow from the University of Kentucky Law School, and another person from Yale University Law School. And the person from Yale University has gone on to have a very distinguished career, and I am certain that everyone in the room knows who he is. We started practicing law the same year. We took the Missouri bar exam at the same time, and that young man's name was Clarence Thomas.
Yeah, it's a name. Yeah, it's come up a couple times. Yeah. So tell me about Clarence Thomas. We know him through his lack of questioning in the Supreme Court. I also, my own personal experience is that Clarence, Justice Thomas, excuse me, when you get together publicly or in a social setting, he's a rockin' tour. He's the funniest guy there ever was. Was he that kind of person?
Yeah, he was. He is a good friend. We don't share a lot of the same legal philosophies today, but he is a good friend. In fact, when he, in his second confirmation, which was very controversial with the allegations of sexual harassment by Anita Hill, he asked me to represent him. And that was my very first legal representation in Washington, D.C., and I am very honored and proud to have represented him. He's a good person, and as I said, I've known him for 50 years. But he's now asking a lot more questions, Greg, than he used to. But I think everyone in the room, while you may not agree with his legal philosophy, would find him a very down-to-earth and good person to talk with and enjoy talking with.
So you're at Monsanto, and there was an idea of placing you from a junior position there to a law firm. Is that how you ended up at King and Spalding?
That is not how I ended up. I really, at some point, thought I really don't really want to be a corporate lawyer. I want to be a litigator. And I was working on a case with King and Spalding. They were representing Monsanto in a case. And when I told them I was leaving Monsanto to go to a firm in St. Louis, I'd accepted a position at a firm in St. Louis, they said, you really need to come to work with us. And I didn't know anything about Atlanta. King and Spalding at that time was based in Atlanta. Now it has offices all over the world. But, and as you may recall, Clarence is from Georgia, and we used to have lunch every week at a Chinese restaurant that was near Monsanto's campus in St. Louis. And I mentioned this to Clarence, just, sort of off the cuff, and he encouraged me to, and I hope I'm not offending anyone in the room who is from St. Louis, but he encouraged me to not stay in St. Louis, but to go to Atlanta, that it's a booming city. And interestingly, back then, this would have been 1976, Atlanta and St. Louis were about the same size, metropolitan area, about 2.5 million people. And today, I believe St. Louis is about 2.5 million people, and Atlanta is approaching 8 million.
So King and Spalding is your next tour of duty. You were there for a few years, and then somehow the public service got you with the U.S. Attorney. So how did that happen? I mean, you go from private practice to public practice.
Yes, that was the beginning of this strange career I've had. I was working very hard as a young associate. I supported, let me back up, King and Spalding was the largest firm in Atlanta at the time. It was a big time firm in terms of supporting Democratic office holders in Georgia, because Georgia at that time was a Democratic state. I nevertheless was a supporter of Ronald Reagan as a young lawyer, and I was also supported a fellow who was running for Senate. No one thought he had a chance. His name was Mac Mattingly, and I supported him. I wrote speeches. Now, again, I was still working. I had a full workload at King and Spalding, and I was doing this in my off time. And surprisingly, Mac won the election. He beat Herman Talmadge during the 1980 election when Reagan won. And he asked me if I wanted to do anything politically, and I really declined. I just wanted to stay with my career. And he did put me on the committee that recommended people to him for judicial appointments, and Georgia has 3 U.S. attorneys. I was on that committee. We picked 2 people for the U.S. attorney position in Atlanta, and for different reasons, they didn't work out. The newspapers started to criticize the Reagan administration for not having a U.S. attorney in Atlanta, and my boss and mentor was Griffin Bell, who had been the Attorney General under Jimmy Carter, and I called him Judge Bell. Judge Bell and the person who was the head of this committee sort of got together and drafted me to become the U.S. Attorney. And I was reluctantly accepted that offer. I thought it might have been a way that Judge Bell was telling me that I wasn't going to make partner in the law firm, but he encouraged me to take the position. But that was the first, not only in terms of public service grade, but that was the first of my pay cuts, because at the time I was a senior associate at King and Spalding, and I remember distinctly I was making $57,000 a year, which was a pretty good amount of money at the time. And the U.S. Attorney job paid $55,000 a year, less than the private position. And that was the first and the smallest of the successive pay cuts I've taken in my 50-year career.
So you go off and you become the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, and you led the Southeastern Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, and the New York Times described you as a moderate who is respected by both Democrats and Republicans. That's the source, Wikipedia, it's of all knowledge. You enjoyed that for a while, and you got a taste of it, but then you went back. Is that because of the administration changes?
Well, no, it's because I was a young lawyer, and I looked at the fact that it was a political appointment, and someday you had to understand that you were not going to hold a political appointment forever. I had a family to raise. I had, like everybody in the room, I had to earn an income and raise my family. So I went back into the private sector and was as a partner at King & Spalding and stayed 16 years, had a wonderful law practice. I was one of the first lawyers in a big firm in Atlanta to establish what we call a white-collar criminal defense practice. And I did that for 16 years before my next decision to leave the private sector.
So you then became Deputy Attorney General of the United States under United States appointed by President George W. Bush on May 10th, 2001, and you were preceded by a guy named Robert Mueller, and then you stayed there, and just before I might forget it, succeeded by James Comey. So a couple of names which have hit the press, and then you're in between there. Was that a surprise to you that you would be selected and nominated for that position?
It was a surprise because I had been told that I was being considered to be the Attorney General after President Bush won the election. Governor Bush won the election. I didn't get selected. He selected John Ashcroft. They asked me, John did not have any federal prosecutorial experience. He'd been a governor of Missouri and he'd been a United States Senator from Missouri, but he didn't have any prosecutorial experience. And I was asked if I wanted to be the Deputy Attorney General. And I don't know if anybody had asked John that, and I said no. I was a senior partner at King & Spalding at the time, and as I mentioned, I had a really good law practice. I was handling matters for corporations and individuals all over the United States, and I said no. Well, the election occurs, and on January 1, I'll never forget it, we get a call from Governor Bush, President-elect Bush. He had not been sworn in, and he called me and asked me if, well, he didn't ask me. He says, I would like for you to be my Deputy Attorney General. I'd like for you to be on the team. And he said, I know you need to talk to your wife about this and think about it. Give me a call tomorrow morning and let me know what your decision has been. Well, man, that was something that came out of left field. And I talked to my wife, and I decided that when the President-elect of the United States asked you to do something, and I've been very fortunate to live in this great country, and the country had been good to me and my family, I didn't think at the time I could really refuse that offer. And I accepted. And I called my financial advisor at the time, and he said, are you crazy? You're 55 years old. You need to start the incline period of your career and start saving and making certain you have enough money for retirement, and you are taking a 90% pay cut. at age 55. I don't have many clients that do that. I did it.
So there you do, and this is May 10th, 2001.
That's when I was sworn in.
Sworn in, and little did one possibly know that 4 months later, on September 11th, 2001, all hell would break loose.
That's right, Greg.
And I'm just going to let you kind of give us a narrative of what happened, you know, how you learned about it, how the Department of Justice sort of reacted to it. I'm sure it's probably spelled out in the book, but I haven't read the book, so I would love to know what it is that happened.
Well, what I do say in the book, and I've said this when I've described the position of Deputy Attorney General, it's really been the most important part of my career. It's the most important thing I've ever done, and it certainly was the most searing job I've ever had. And I will start after I was confirmed by the United States Senate. I started going to a lot of meetings that I had no experience with during the time that I'd practiced law. And I started going to National Security Council meetings. You remember, I basically was a domestic lawyer. I was a criminal defense lawyer doing work inside the United States. Didn't do much work outside of the country. Had done no work in the national security or intelligence area. The Department of Justice at the time was not heavily oriented toward that area either. But I started going to all these meetings, and it became clear that there was a lot of noise in the intelligence system with respect to terrorist activity aimed at United States interests, led by Osama bin Laden. And the reason this came clear was that CIA and other intelligence agencies, they were getting information about plans to attack U.S. interests. And that was something that I became aware of. I would have meetings with my staff at the Department of Justice as to what we should be doing to deal with. At this time, the Department of Justice focused as it related to terrorism on after the fact investigation and prosecution. The World Trade Center had been attacked, by the way, by Osama bin Laden in 1993, I believe. And those individuals were arrested, investigated, and prosecuted. At the same time, I had two really fine gentlemen working for me. David Criss, who was an intelligence expert. I kept him over from the Clinton administration, and Michael Chertoff, who went on to become the Secretary of Homeland Security. They were working with me in the Department of Justice, and they told me that, Larry, we have a problem because the intelligence officials in the FBI and really the CIA are not talking with the law enforcement officials. And they're not sharing information. There were legitimate reasons for this because of our concern about misusing intelligence information that can be gotten without the protections of the Constitution that protect us as U.S. citizens. But nevertheless, they weren't talking to each other, and they were preventing us from being able to connect the dots. So I wrote a memo to the Department of Justice intelligence officials who were under my jurisdiction. I could not write a memo to the CIA individuals because that was not under my jurisdiction. I wrote a memo and said, you guys need to share information and you need to talk more. And I wrote that memo in August, and we called it lowering the wall. When I wrote the memo, I obviously checked with my boss, John Ashcroft. He approved it. But there were some people who were very upset, who were concerned about civil liberties, and that we were opening the door to allowing abuses of civil liberties of Americans because of intelligence, using intelligence information. Now, that's what happened. And of course, you know, my memo was too late, or too insufficient, too impotent. I wrote the memo early August, and we were hit on September 11, and over 3,000 citizens perished. And that's the end of the story, pretty much, until I started to write this book. And I then made a decision, while I wasn't going to dwell on it, I wanted to talk about how that event affected me. And the way it affected me was, I was just very guilty. I felt very guilty as to what happened. I was the number 2 person in the Department of Justice. I should have done everything in my power to protect American citizens from terroristic activities. That's what the function of a government is. And I didn't do it. 3,000 people, over 3,000 people perished. And in the meantime, I had all kinds of other responsibilities, but I became ill. My internal medicine physician recommended that I see a therapist, and I did, and she was very, very good. I worked through it, but it took me a long time to work through it. And one of the things that concerned me was that there was a period where it got pretty bad, and she prescribed medicine for me. And at that time, if you were under treatment for certain kinds of illnesses, you were considered a security risk, and you might lose your classification to get classified information, secret information. And that's when I decided to leave the government. But what's really been sort of buoying for me during this time period, I've given, like today, I've given a few talks about this. It really has, because I just kept this a secret for years and years. I never shared this information with anybody. So number one, it's been cathartic for me. But number two, I've been surprised at the number of people who have gone through the same thing that I did and who have suffered depression for all kinds of different reasons. And so, you know, in a way, the process of writing this book, has flushed out all of that information. And again, this was a period in my professional life that was challenging for me, but it's something I'm very proud of. I'm very proud of what we did working. I worked very closely with President Bush. I saw him almost every morning when we were both in DC. I'm proud of what we were able to do to forestall these kinds of attacks from happening again. There were all kinds of men who were preparing to do these evil deeds in other cities around the world, and including the United States. And I'm proud that we were able to thwart them. But it really is a challenging period in my life, and one that I didn't feel comfortable discussing until I got in the process of writing this book. And then, of course, when you think about what happened 23 years ago today, and I was watching all these events on TV, and there are a couple of things I would, if you bear with me, I'd like to share with you. The morning of the attack, I didn't really know exactly what had happened. I had a suspicion when I saw the plane hit the second building. And my boss, John Ashcroft, was out of the city, and I get a call from Condoleezza Rice, who at the time was the national security advisor. She hadn't been tapped to be Secretary of State. And she said to me, there's been an attack. I want you to stay in your office. Someone will be there in no more than 10 minutes. Well, literally, in about 5 minutes, 6 United States Marshals came into my office. And the way I described what they did to me was arrest me. They didn't ask me, should I do anything? They just said, Mr. Thompson, come with us. And they put me in a vehicle and took me to the undisclosed location, or if our government is under attack, they take officials, and I get to the undisclosed location, and I see members of Congress, senators, members of the cabinet, Supreme Court justices, all out there walking around. And we didn't know what to expect. You know, we thought our government was under really a much larger attack than it actually was. But that's something that I'll always remember. And not on the humorous side, but sort of on the interesting side. That morning, I was set to meet with the United States Attorney from Rhode Island, and we had an organized crime investigation that she had developed in her office, based in Providence, and we were discussing how we were going to launch this organized crime investigation, and we were going to meet the morning of September 11, 2001. Obviously, the meeting was canceled, and in the process of writing this book, I just thought, you know, those men who were the targets of that investigation may have been the luckiest individuals in the United States, because that investigation didn't get started. It just sort of died. And I'm sure some of them eventually were brought to justice. But I just think about, you know, what might have been, but for 9/11. One other thing I would like to mention is I had a little tit for tat with the government ethics office at the time. I'd been with King and Spalding for 16 years, and I had what I thought was a retirement package that would help me supplement my reduction in income when I went back into government. But the retirement package, those of you who may be in the finance world, the retirement package was not funded. It was based upon the profits of the law firm. And the ethics office said, you can't get, you have an interest in that law firm. Even if you recuse yourself, you have an interest in that, and you can't do that. You have to take everything that you're entitled to right now, not over a 10-year period, as the plan said, but you need to take it all now, which meant I'd have to pay taxes. I wouldn't get the value of the growth of the value in the law firm. And you know, I think back, if that decision, which didn't come down until late in November of '01, if that decision had come to me in August, early August of '01, I might have said, you know, this is not worth it for me to, you know, make this kind of financial sacrifice for my family. But, you know, after 9/11, this decision came down, and, you know, you had these 19 men who were willing to die for their evil cause. Well, I could certainly I can certainly lose money to protect my country and to serve my country. So, you know, that's what happened. But this, as I said, this was a very important and searing time of my life, and I have a great deal of respect for the men and women, not only in our military, but in our intelligence community around the world. And I really have a great deal of respect for the intelligence officials in other countries, all around the world, because we had to work with intelligence officials in a number of countries in dealing with some of these terrorists, Al-Qaeda people, and everyone in the civilized world was very cooperative, and I'll never forget that.
Larry,
sorry I took so long.
No, not on the contrary. I'd like to, without defying confidences, but I'm curious because you're right there. You're in this undisclosed location with the power structure of the government, but at the same time, this is unprecedented. There's no playbook for how to react to that.
None.
Strategically, was the Department of Justice involved in reaching out to the English embassy, to the French embassies, to how to react? I mean, just how to coordinate the reaction.
Yeah, the Department of Justice was deeply involved in those activities, Greg. Our mission in one day, our mission went from after the fact investigation, grand jury investigation, and then prosecution to prevention. In one day, wasn't going to do anybody any good if we were dead. And so we had to change the whole mission of the department as it related to terrorism. And again, when you're dealing with prevention, that bumps up against very legitimate concerns about civil liberties. And we always had to deal with that balance, if you will. I don't know if we got it right, but we didn't. To your point, there was no playbook. And one of the really poignant times in terms of dealing with all these issues is that as a result of a National Security Council meeting, we needed to make a request of the British government. And I was tapped to go to the British ambassador to the United States home, along with Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Deputy Defense Secretary. You may remember that name.
Yep.
And so Paul and I made an arrangement to go see the British ambassador to our country. And on the way over, this was a very funky thing we were going to ask the Brits to do. And on the way over, I said to Paul, I don't think they're going to do this. There's no way they're going to do what we were asking them to do. But our bosses want us to ask. Paul agreed, and we get to the residence of the British ambassador. We laid out what we wanted the British government to do. And he leaned over, he was a tall, lean man, and he leaned over and said, I get it. And we need to get some velocity behind this. And they did it. They did what our country asked them to do. And in my mind, that just cemented my view that they are they are perhaps our strongest ally and friend in the world, and we could always count on them.
Just as an aside, two quick notes, Larry. I was involved in the co-founding of the Robert Jackson Center that year, and we wanted to do our very first event, and it was to invite the Nuremberg prosecutors to back, though we're still alive. And I got a letter, and got it here. I found it yesterday, September 11th, 2001, addressed to me from a prosecutor, the number 2 guy with Robert Jackson. And he said, Dear Greg, I've spent this morning watching the TV reports of the destruction of the World Trade Center in New York and other bombings on this tragic September 11th. Obviously, the United States must be in a state of undeclared war against the terrorists. One recalls the warnings of Justice Jackson in his final address to the IMT. 2 world wars have left a legacy of dead which number more than all the armies engaged in any war that made ancient or medieval history. No half-century ever witnessed slaughter on such a scale, such cruelties and inhumanities, such wholesale deportations of peoples into slavery, such annihilations of minorities. The terror of Torquemada pales before the Nazi Inquisition. These deeds are the overshadowing of historical facts by which generations to come will remember this decade. In his postscript, perhaps he missed his forecast by just 1 year. And he wrote it literally as he's watching TV and reminding itself of Justice Jackson. At the time, did you have any sense that we were in an undeclared war against the terrorists?
Oh, absolutely, I did. And it was not necessarily on our government, but it was on us as a people. And let me explain. One of the things that I had to do in terms of our response to the terrorists was to make certain that our Congress was briefed about some of the actions. These were extraordinary actions that we were taking under President Bush. And we briefed members of Congress, Democrat, Republicans. The Democrats, some of them, had no use for President Bush politically. But for that one period of time when I would go up on the Hill and brief a Democratic senator, I never got any pushback. We were all together as a country. And I don't want to get Pollyannish about it, but we need to think about what we can do to come together. And I thought, again, as I was looking through the crowd this morning and watching on TV the crowd and the speeches and reading the names, I was thinking about some of the things that I saw from a forensic standpoint after 9/11 and the charred bodies. And one of the things that came to my mind when I saw that 23 years ago were that these were charred bodies. You didn't know whether a person was black or white, what race. The terrorists, the evil people, they didn't send a warning to all Christians saying you shouldn't go into the building because we're only attacking Jews. They didn't send a warning to any Latino. They were after us because we were Americans. And we need to understand that more and more. We have more in common, and we have more that we need to do to protect ourselves as Americans, as opposed to somebody from Georgia or somebody from Michigan. And that just kind of ran through my mind this morning. It was my thinking at the time, 23 years ago, and the country was, very united. Obviously, we made mistakes in response to 9/11. Again, as you said, Greg, there was no playbook, but I can tell you they were mistakes that everyone made in good faith, because I know I did not want that to happen again on my watch as a government official. And I think we have, rectified some of the mistakes that we've made, and some of the very controversial things that we have done. And you guys may remember the Patriot Act, and a lot of people who had legitimate civil liberties concerns about that act when it was enacted. Much of that Patriot Act remains in place because, in my judgment, we need those provisions to protect Americans from terror.
Was the Department of Justice working closely immediately thereafter with Congress to draft and sort of strategize the Patriot Act and other related legislation?
Yes, we had a whole group of lawyers in the Department of Justice that were working closely with not only Congress, but other agencies, the Defense Department, namely the CIA, the Treasury Department, because dealing with terrorist financing, all of that was very, very important. And I will say, if you'll permit me to just talk a little bit more about this whole episode of my career in life.
Please.
I'm not at all sanguine that we've done everything we can to prevent this from happening again. And that pains me. And one of the reasons I decided to write the book in the twilight of my career is that I really want to trumpet my experience as to things that I think we need to do. And I have a section in the book where I deal with what I call the ticking time bomb as it relates to international terrorists, not a domestic terrorist. And I'll get to the domestic terrorists after I talk about this, but the ticking time bomb scenario. or there's something that you know that's going to happen. You can't go to the FISA court and just listen in on the conversations. You need to take someone off the streets and interrogate them. They're here in the United States legally, and they have certain constitutional rights. What do? Do you take that person off the streets and run the risk of a false arrest charge against you as a government official? Or do you just say, I don't want to get into trouble, I don't want to rock the boat, and I'm not going to do anything? And then what happens if that risk turns out to have been a true one? So I really think, as it relates to international terrorism, and believe me, it remains a threat, I really think it's time for us to have a national security court, much like we have on the FISA side, where we engage in electronic surveillance without all the protections of the Constitution against foreign persons, not U.S. citizens. As U.S. citizens, we all are under the protections of the Constitution. But under FISA, we can listen in on the conversations of foreign individuals where there's been a predicate laid for listening in on those conversations because they're involved in illegal and perhaps terroristic activities. We need that when we need it in a rare occasion, when we need quickly to interrogate a foreign person. We need that on the rare occasion when we need to have a rendition of a foreign person and send them to their outside the United States to their country citizenship. We don't have that, and I think there are a number of very liberal civil liberty lawyers that I've worked with over the years. They are in favor of this. Obviously, someone that's on a more conservative nature like myself, I'm in favor of it, but we haven't gotten it done. We don't want to give, especially in light of all the politics in recent years, we don't want to give the government a blank check to just do anything it wants to. And the National Security Court would be made up of federal judges, like in the FISA court. We would have defense lawyers who have security clearances, and they would meet and deal with these very complicated issues. They wouldn't have to meet very often, but it just pains me to see that we don't have something like that. It pains me that our hardworking government officials are still on the hook for making these tough decisions. I made one when I was Deputy Attorney General. We had a guy, and some of this is still classified, but I can say that he was a member of Al Qaeda. He was a dual Syrian Canadian citizen. He was transiting through the United States to Montreal, and we intercepted him. And I made the decision to send him to Syria. He claims he was tortured in Syria, and at some point he was released, and the Canadian government had changed, and they gave him several $1 million in reparations. I was sued long after I left government, and the government agreed to represent me because one of the issues was if I had deliberately sent this man to Syria and knowing he would be tortured, that's a violation of the anti-torture statute, and I would be subject to criminal penalties, liability. The government agreed to represent me, but when FBI agents would call and want to interview me, or members of the congressional and investigative committees wanted to interview me, and I wanted a lawyer present, they said, no, Mr. Thompson, your job is to cooperate with these investigators, and we can't provide legal representation to you. Well, that's just, my mother didn't raise a fool. So I had to retain out of my own pocket lawyers to represent me when these individuals wanted to talk to me. And I got what we call in the legal business, Greg, the friend and family rate. But they had to charge me. And after it was all over, the Second Circuit of the Court of Appeals in Boston ruled in my favor that I acted appropriately as a government official. But after it was all over, I had incurred several $1,000s in legal fees. And I don't think that's right, that we subject government officials, especially one who took a 90% pay cut when he went into government, to have to pay several $1,000s in legal fees because of he was serving his country. So I'll get off that soapbox.
I'm just thinking about, Larry, you were just there for 4 months. I mean, 4 months, you're just in the Justice Department, and bingo, this happens. And I just, as unrelated to anything, but just a little postscript, there was a guy named Ben Sliney in his first day as the National Operations Manager of the FAA on September 11th. This is day one. He had to order the American airspace cleared for all international flights, exercise the emergency preparedness plan. I just think about that as I was reading this today. One day, can you walk in on your day one, and oh, by the way, we got to exercise something that has never happened in the history of the FAA. You were going to talk also a little bit about, I don't want to get you off from your days at Department of Justice, but you're going to talk a little bit about domestic terrorism and your thoughts about that, and maybe this is the opportunity to segue to that.
Well, as the FBI has said, it remains a serious threat. And I really want to make this point very clear in terms of the blank check we don't want to give the government. And I do not want to, in any way, no matter what a threat, no matter how much I believe a threat a person may be, I do not want to take away any of the constitutional protections of any U.S. citizen. However, I do think we need to be very reasonable and realistic as to what our law enforcement agencies can do. So if you or I can go on the internet and whatever people want to put up on the internet, I'm not a big Facebook person, but and I'm not a big Twitter or X person, but I do get these things and anybody can look at them. It makes no sense to me that if anybody can go look at some of these things, why we want to restrict law enforcement agencies from looking at something that anyone else can. So I think we need to adopt common sense measures in order to protect ourselves from domestic terrorism. And we just had an incident in Georgia where a young man, killed 4 kids in a high school. And he was interviewed by the FBI a year ago. But there were limitations as to what they could do and who they could talk to after they interviewed him. And I know we have these legitimate concerns, but I'd just like to think that we devote as much common sense to them as possible. And again, I want to say, I don't want, if someone wants to listen into my phone conversations, they should obviously have to have a search warrant and a warrant to do so. If someone wants to go into my home, and we can't give up our constitutional protections, but we just need to exercise, I think, a little bit more common sense. That's all.
As you wrote the book, and I can't wait to actually read the book, Quiet Counsel, Looking Back on a Life of Service to the Law, it caused you to reflect, as you've mentioned, on that which occurred, because you're now articulating it, memorializing it in a book. Were there some surprises to yourself? Did you trick your memory and say, I forgot about this? And something that, as you were writing it down, it like, wow.
Well, I don't know if it's that kind of a surprise. What I had to really decide in my own mind is, why am I writing this book? Is this a vanity project where I'm just trying to ensure my place in history by sort of being defensive and protecting myself before I die? Or what is the purpose of all this? And so I had to kind of resolve that. And then once I sort of got there, then what are you going to say? And so I remember when I had a working first draft, I went to some publishers, and the lawyer for one of the publishers, he actually read it, and he says, Larry, I think this is a very interesting book, but I don't think it's going to sell much. It's not too sexy. And what you need to do is to identify your enemies, and you've been around a long time. I'm sure you have some enemies. Well, you need to identify your enemies and then write about them in the book and settle the scores. And I said to myself, that's not the way I want to end, this career by, kicking dirt in people's faces and creating more arguments. So I just kind of decided I wanted to write something where I talked about the things that I've worked on, the things that I think can help make society better from just a legal standpoint, and pass on my experience, and that's it.
On your experience, you left government in 2003, and was that, did you just get to a point where you woke up one morning, turned to your wife and said, that's it, aha? Was there an aha moment?
Well, there were a lot of things. I was spending $3,000 to $4,000 a month more than I was making. That's not very sustainable. And again, I had my illness, and I was taking medicine. So I just felt that was the time to leave, and I was able to move on into a different realm. I'd never, other than my brief time at Monsanto, I never worked in-house, and I was able to get the position of chief legal counsel, general counsel for PepsiCo, and was able to spend 10 years at PepsiCo, and that was a great time in my life, and we were able to do a lot of really interesting things.
Well, I remember you speaking at the Robert Jackson Center in 2013 during that time period, and we made sure that at the rostrum there was every Pepsi product humanly possible, just so you could get some mileage out of all of that.
I can see some of the people in the audience. Does anyone own PepsiCo stock in the audience? Because I was working for you if you did, if you owned the stock.
But then after you left PepsiCo, you had what most people probably don't fully understand, but an incredible appointment from the Federal District Court in California, wasn't it?
No, it was in the Eastern District of Michigan.
Okay, excuse me. Regarding Volkswagen, explain that.
Well, I think all of you know, Volkswagen was engaged in an unbelievable scandal involving vehicles sold in the United States, in which they cheated our government in terms of developing software where Volkswagen cars, when they were tested by the EPA, showed one result on emissions. Diesel cars with diesel engines, they would show one result, but when the cars got on the road, they showed another result, much higher result, and that went on for about 9 years, and it resulted in a great degradation of the environment in the United States. And Volkswagen pled guilty charges, and the judge required them, pursuant to a plea agreement, to have a monitor. And then I was selected by the U.S. Department of Justice to be the monitor for Volkswagen. And it was I was 71 when I took the assignment, and it probably, in hindsight, was a little bit too much. I had to travel to Germany for 3 years plus once a month, and that was pretty tough for me. But we got through it, and I'm very pleased with the fact that Volkswagen is a very important company around the world, over 700,000 employees, and I'm very pleased that we were able to have a hand in helping them right the ship. The people that I dealt with at Volkswagen, they clearly wanted to get past this. They were very cooperative with my team. And I would like to say that we helped right the ship. We didn't write it by ourselves, but we helped right the ship.
Larry, here we are on September 11th, 2023. 24, excuse me. Where have I been? It's a great year. 2024. And if you look at this audience here, there's about 150 really intelligent, high-end folks at Chautauqua, part of the Rhodes Scholar. You lived it. You lived it like nobody else did live it on the inside, literally in the bunker. What's the message you might want to deliver to these folks?
Well, by the way, my book is not about my life. The first chapter is very short. It's a little bit about that. And then the last chapter is more philosophical. And one of the things that I sort of look at about is, as we get older, and I'll be 79 next month. And as we get older, what is all this about? And I guess I've tried to, as I look back, it's very, very simple. I've really tried to make certain, in terms of my profession, that our world is more just. This country is more prosperous, and it's more inclusive. And it's a great country. I talk about the fact that my parents allowed me to dream, which reminds me of Dr. Benjamin Mays, who was the president of Morehouse College, said that we all should dream, and it's actually a sin not to dream. And finally, one of the reasons I wanted to write the book in terms of my experiences and how the law can be used to help change society for the better is a quote, Greg, you're very familiar with, from Robert Jackson, in which he said, and we need to get the word out for citizens to be a part of the change, in which he said, it's not the function of government to prevent citizens from falling into error. It's the function of citizens to keep the government from falling into error. And so, I think, as citizens, we need to stay engaged, doing things like all of you are doing at Chautauqua. And, I guess, yes, officially I'm retired, but I'm still active in a number of things. And I'm just hoping that, I'm just one small voice in helping keep us citizens engaged, that we can make this great country even better, more just, and more prosperous for people for years to come.
Larry, I thank you ever so much for spending time today on this special occasion and sharing this with this special audience. And the audience needs to know, because I forgot to mention, that Larry is on the board here at Chautauqua Institution. So part of his special time is at this special place. So to a special guy, say thank you very much, Larry, for your time.
Thank you. Have fun.